Good morning, everyone. Good morning. I'm Paula Allen Mears, Chancellor of the University of Illinois at Chicago. It is indeed my privilege and pleasure to welcome all of you to our university and to the 2012 UIC Urban Forum. We're delighted to continue our long-time commitment to a national discussion of the vital issues facing urban areas, and to host such a stellar group of speakers and participants ready to offer their insights and unique perspectives. I'm particularly grateful to the distinguished co-chairs of this year's event, the Honorable Illinois Governor Pat Quinn, Chicago Mayor Rahm Emanuel, and Cook County Board President Toni Preckwinkle. In 2008, the first time in human history, more than half of the world's population lived in cities. 2008 also marked the start of the Great Recession, the worst economic downturn since the 1930s. This period was not only devastating to the social fabric of the nation as the Great Depression, it wasn't, because there were safeguards that somewhat blunted the impact. For example, unemployment was 25% at the height of the Great Depression, but only 9% during the period 2008 to the present. The Dow Jones Industrial Average dropped 89% during the Depression, compared with some 30% at the worst of the period that we have just experienced. And bank foreclosures reached nearly 50% in the 1930s and 10% since 2008. Now, I know that's not good news, but think about it, yet even with safety nets softening the fall, the Great Recession placed economic pressures on urban centers. In recent years, our nation has also experienced increasingly severe national and natural disasters. The Hurricane Sandy comes to mind. This is the latest example. These catastrophic events point to the vulnerability of our densely populated metropolitan areas and warn us of the unpredictable dangers of the economic and physical and infrastructures that are at risk in large metropolitan areas. This makes today's discussion, the topic today is metropolitan resilience in a time of economic turmoil. This topic is extremely important and timely. The quality of urban life depends upon the capacity of metropolitan areas to respond to the challenges of the global era, as well as economic and environmental and social challenges that we experience on a day-to-day basis. Also, for cities to thrive, all of the citizens must be able to contribute to the well-being of that society, that city. And therefore, we must make certain that the workforce of our cities is well-trained and skilled for a new era. And that's where universities like UIC and the University of Illinois come into play. Urbanization and globalization bring unique opportunities and challenges. We all know this. But we want our cities to be resilient. And in order for cities to be resilient, this will require a different paradigm. It will require cooperation from all sectors: government, the corporate sector, the civic sector, the community, and the academy. Forums such as this one provide an opportunity to share experiences and to hear from thought leaders, as well as those on the front line attempting to make our cities grow and prosper. Public research universities like UIC serve as a catalyst for stimulating debate about the challenges and opportunities. This is our hope. Today, we hope to drill down on the issues before us as a society, as a nation. Before I go any further, I would like to thank our generous sponsors. This event would not be possible without their tremendous enthusiasm, dedication, and financial support. These corporate and civic leaders believe, as we do, that the health and prosperity of our cities depends upon creativity, innovation, and sharing best practices around the world. I'm inspired by their commitment and grateful for their leadership. Their names are They should be. I shouldn't be featured here. The names of our sponsors should appear on the screen momentarily. Let's give them a round of applause. I think, where are they? Well, perhaps the video will get caught up with the narrative. Anyway, I'd also like to recognize our wonderful media partner, WBEZ-FM, Chicago's national public radio station. I know that they're in the audience. Thank you so much for your support. Now, the video has finally caught up with the narrative. It is my pleasure to introduce the University of Illinois Chair of our Board of Trustees, Christopher Kennedy. I know in this audience he needs no introduction. Everyone knows Christopher Kennedy and his deep commitment to social justice, to the urban resiliency conversation. And here is my boss, Chairman Kennedy.
Well, thank you all.
You know, I have a question for you. Will you stand with workers and offer a fair contract, yes or no?
I think we've had a great track record of standing with workers and offering fair contracts. We've done that in the past. We'll continue to do it in the future. You know, I just want to point out how lucky we are to have Paula Allen Mears. She is recognized around the nation as one of the great leaders in academic higher education, and we love the fact that she's with us here at UIC. I am a volunteer at the University of Illinois, and for the last 3 years, I've served as chairman of the Board of Trustees. It is in that capacity as chairman that it is my honor to be able to welcome you all here to the university's Chicago campus. UIC educates nearly 27,000 students per year, and we have total annual research expenditures of about $250 million, which is more than all of the other public universities in Illinois combined, with the exception of our Urbana campus. We train here in Chicago nearly 20% of Illinois physicians, over 40% of its dentists, a third of its pharmacists, and we are the largest educator of this state's nurses. The entire campus was the vision of Mayor Richard J. Daley. There is this great quote from President Kennedy: "Every man can make a difference and every man should try." This extraordinary campus is living proof of the notion that the vision of our community's future being developed in this room by all of you today can fundamentally change our cities forever, just as Mayor Daley did. The future of cities and our metro areas are critical not only to Chicago, but to the entire world economy as well. Residents of the Chicago metro area make up 75% of Illinois' population and generates nearly 80% of the state's economic output. 50 years ago, Chicago was one of the 10 largest cities in the world. Today, we're struggling to stay in the top 30. Before the start of the last recession, we were ranked 115th on the list of the fastest growing large metropolitan communities in the world. After the last recession, we've dropped down to number 127. Of the 80 wealthiest communities in the United States, Illinois is no longer home to a single one. If a company is going to allocate assets to a particular geographic market, we need to be cognizant that those companies may allocate their assets somewhere else, someplace with more people, greater economic activity, higher population growth rates, and greater electronic connectivity. We are lucky to have all of you here today and to have you thinking about these issues on our behalf and protecting our local economy by advocating for the success of global cities. It is my pleasure to introduce our first panel. Our moderator will be Neela Boodoo, who is the business reporter for WBEZ. She has been a business reporter since 2000 for important institutions like Reuters in London and Washington, and the Associated Press in Miami and the South Florida Sun Sentinel. Prior to moving to Chicago, Neela was a reporter for the Miami Herald, where she covered the local economy. Her stories have been broadcast on Marketplace and Morning Edition, All Things Considered, and Weekend Edition Saturday. She joined WBEZ in 2010 as the Chicago reporter for Changing Gears, a multi-station project that helped document the economic transformation of the industrial Midwest. This fall, she has been reporting for Front and Center, American Dream Deferred, a WBEZ series exploring economic mobility in the Great Lakes region. Our panelists today include Steve Koch, who is the Deputy Mayor for the City of Chicago. Steve received an MBA and a JD from the University of Chicago and went on to clerk for the Federal Appellate Court Judge Richard Cudahy here on the 7th Circuit. Before joining the city, Steve was chairman of the Global Mergers and Acquisitions Group at Credit Suisse, where he and his team oversaw more than $1 trillion of mergers and acquisitions. I frequently describe Steve as one of the brightest people I have met in Chicago. Our second panelist, Neil Kerr, is the Deputy Chief of Staff for Cook County Board President Tony Preckwinkle. Neil graduated from Northwestern University, went on to join the John Buck Company, and then helped lead the effort to bring the International Olympic Games to Chicago as part of the Chicago 2016 committee. As Deputy Chief of Staff, Neil is responsible for developing and implementing strategies and high-profile initiatives, and also helps with the day-to-day operations in the Cook County Board President's office. Our final panelist this morning is Crystal Thompson, who is the Deputy Governor for the state of Illinois. Ms. Thompson is a graduate of the Ohio State University and has a master's in public policy from the University of Chicago. Crystal was the executive director of the Ohio Executive Medical Management Administration. She then went on to become the regional director for the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services Region 5, where she led the federal government's lead agency in protecting the health of all Americans. In February of 2011, Governor Quinn tapped her to be responsible for overseeing the development and implementation of the governor's entire public policy agenda. Our panel this morning is titled Chicago Metropolitan Resilience, Redefining the New Normal. Before I turn it over to Neela, I hope all of you will join me in giving our panelists a round of applause.
Well, good morning, everyone. I'm Nyla Boodoo, and I'm a business reporter at WBEZ. And while it's my job to tell stories, it's also my job to look at the numbers. So when we talk about Chicago's new normal in terms of the numerical legacy of the Great Recession, it can look a little daunting. For the first time, we have more than 500,000 people living in poverty in our suburbs, more than within the city limits. Our city budget deficit is around $300 million. Cook County's is around $260 million. And of course, as we're all aware, that same fiscal crisis is also at the state level. Illinois' credit rating is abysmal, in no small part due to our unfunded pension debt, which is also the worst in the nation. But it's not all without hope. We've seen some really great, good job growth in the city and the region for the past 2 years. We've seen that city budget deficit cut almost in half. And the fiscal crisis has led to an unprecedented partnership between the city and the county. With savings, the goal of savings, I believe, was about $66 million, and we're halfway there to that goal by 2014. And then we have breaking news this week of the possibility, and again, I'm gonna hinge on possibility, of a deal that will try to fix our state pension system. So our original panelists are not here today in part because of that breaking news. But these people are, imagine, much like many of you in the room today, policymakers at the city, county, and state levels. And this panel is about resilience in the time of turmoil. And I want this to be a really good conversation between all of us just about that. So to that end, I'm gonna call you all by your first name. I hope that you guys are okay with that. You can call me Nyla. And I want to start with the idea of pensions and breaking news, but first I want to give you all a chance to sort of respond to what I said about what the new normal is for Chicago and the city and what you all see it being.
Well, good morning, and it is a pleasure to be here. Really, I think for us, when we think about the new normal, you have to think about it in two ways. And one is just the level of need, who we serve and where they are, and what their life experience is very different. So when we look at the social safety net and how we respond to those needs and how we serve those people, we're looking at a time when we are both struggling with serious budget challenges at the state level. We also are seeing an increase in need and the need to change how we do business in many ways because we are serving different demographics. We're serving people in different places. You mentioned the suburbs and the new face of suburban poverty. And then the other is really the budget itself, and the fact that the new normal for us is years and years of budget reductions, of budget challenges, and that's something that we do not see changing, at least in the short term. We are looking at things that hopefully will change that in the longer term, but really continuing to have to do more with less, which is a typical buzzword these days, but that is the reality of the new normal.
Steve, what about for the city of Chicago?
Well, I think the city finds itself, and the state and the region find itself at a really interesting moment in history and a moment in time. I was listening to what Chris was saying and getting a little depressed about where we are, but I think that's against a pretty interesting backdrop that to me is sort of the starting point, which is I deeply believe, and I think most of the data would confirm, that we're in a period of a resurgence of central cities, of the critical nature of a city as a form of sort of human endeavor, the organizing principle of how people want to live their lives. And that sort of is the huge opportunity facing us. That's the big opportunity. We are equally at a point where I think we're sort of at the tail end and really feeling the absolute full force and brunt of many, many years of really deferring cost, of not recognizing the true cost of the public sector, of sort of accumulated, you don't want to say debris, but long built up systems and cost and lack of revenue that leads to sort of structural deficits that exist at all levels of government, and all levels of government are dealing with. And equally importantly, in fact, probably more importantly right now, these what you could consider just completely screwed up and out of whack balance sheets, whether it be on the pension side, which we talk about a lot, or for that matter on the debt side. The public sector has really lived on fumes for way too long, for many, many years, and it's not going to get fixed by January 8th or 9th. It won't get fixed this year, but I think a critical element of government today is being honest about facing where we really are, being honest with taxpayers and with citizens about what the costs of the public sector are, what the opportunities of the public sector are, how we're going to respond to the social challenges that we face and that are exacerbated dramatically by the sort of global economy of the last couple of years, and how that sort of sorts itself out. That's the issue we face. Really exciting time, incredible opportunity in that, but it's certainly not a time, business as usual is over. And we couldn't continue it if we wanted to, and it seems to me there certainly are forces that would like to. We just can't afford to, and most importantly, whether we want to or not, the financial markets that basically support government in the modern era won't tolerate it.
Yeah, I think, to echo both Crystal and Steve's thoughts, everything that we do right now is looked through the lens of fiscal responsibility. And that's the way governments should operate. It's the way they should have been operating over the past 50 years. But what you see is that a lot of decisions that our leaders made over the past 50 years are coming due right now and are affecting us right now. What's different about the time now is that I think the electorate and the citizenry is engaged around the issue of fiscal responsibility. They understand the issues of pensions, they understand the issues of balanced budgets, and they understand that every time you allocate a dollar towards borrowing more against debt for the future, it's a dollar that doesn't go towards critical services. And I think you see some new leaders, throughout, the city, the county, the state, that have campaigned on fiscal responsibility and have really done a good job of providing that message and giving that message and doling it out to the constituents who are really buying into it. So when you talk about the budget gaps, at the county, I can speak from our own experience. We walked in the door, we had a $500 million budget gap, actually $487 million out of a $3 billion budget. And we're trying to roll back the sales tax here. We had to make a lot of really tough decisions and hard choices. And a lot of them were, based around employee headcount and layoffs and things that, about 15 or 20 years ago, you would see politicians doing everything they could to avoid. But we were able to work with our labor leaders. We were able to work with communities and say, listen, for us to be sustainable in the future, we have to make these decisions right now. And we were able to do so and actually garner some good support around it. So all the decisions that we make are look through the lens of fiscal responsibility, and that's the new normal right now, for better or for worse.
So speaking of fiscal responsibility and the notion of years of deferring our costs, let's talk about pensions. I'm curious to get all of your take on the action this week with pension reform, what you all think needs to happen, and what you think will happen.
You want me to start again?
The state
Sure,
problem, you
Crystal.
get to start.
Yeah, I think this one.
Then we can all just sort of,
Well, I appreciate what Steve said about the new normal is really having to be honest with taxpayers about the challenges that we face and what the cost of government truly is. And that's something that we at the state level and that Governor Quinn particularly has been trying to do, is to really educate the public about the cost of our 5 state pension systems, the unfunded liability, which has grown to over $95 billion, and that something has to be done, about it, that, this is not a status quo that is sustainable, and that in fact has gotten to a crisis level for us in Illinois, and that has to move forward. So I think that, first of all, that was a big lift in order to really even start talking about that, which is something that, some people had known about, but had never really been discussed in a public way. And beginning that conversation now, I think more people do understand this. There's been a lot of attention paid to it, and because of that, there's been a lot more activity around coming out with proposals and really engaging in true dialogue about what can be done. So we think, as the breaking news from yesterday, and having a group of legislators that have been very engaged in this and have come out with a new proposal as very positive, because it just means that more people are actively looking at this, and more people understand that something has to be done, even if we're not yet at a place where we all agree what that something is. But I do believe that because we have that kind of momentum, because we have people who truly understand that for Illinois to move forward in a positive way, this is the biggest elephant in the room that we have to acknowledge and we have to deal with. We will get something done by in the beginning of January. And again, that's not going to solve our immediate problems, but it at least stops the problem from getting worse and allows us to really focus on how to dig ourselves out of this huge hole.
And not just for Illinois, obviously, but for the city. I know the city Chicago's payments for pension obligations could reach, I think, is it $1.2 billion by 2015? I mean, from the city perspective, what's the...
Well, the city is not dissimilar from the state in terms of having a profound issue facing it. Complicated by some of the peculiarities of the state system, where we pay for our teachers' pension. Some other communities, that's a state bill that's paid. But you take a step back, and basically what we have is a system we were talking before we came up, it's not entirely clear, nobody's really done the work that I know of to go back and say at what moment this really tipped over into sort of a trend towards a problem. But basically for somewhere between 20 and 30 years, state pension funds, city pension funds have been a convenient place to borrow from. They basically have been, money has been taken out, or really more precisely, we have not funded our true responsibility. And that's been the sort of plug factor in virtually all public sector budgets. So above and beyond the structural deficit that exists just in terms of current cost versus current revenue, you have this sort of long-term expense that has been inadequately, or long-term item that has been inadequately funded. So where are we today? You have individuals, workers, who either retirees or current workers who've done what they were supposed to. They entered into an agreement to come to work, and they were going to get paid, and they were promised various benefits. You have the people who negotiated those benefits on their behalf, whether it be union leadership or the people who were responsible for securing those contracts, who entered into arrangements with expecting benefits that probably never could be paid. They weren't going to be adequately funded. They weren't adequately currently being funded. They were frequently increased for sort of other reasons, because it was a convenient place to, if 10 years ago you wanted to solve a contract problem and politically you couldn't raise wages, you would extend the lower the retirement age, or decrease the accrual rate, or give some other benefit that nobody focused on what that might have, and enormous financial consequences in the long run. So you have workers, you have people who negotiated probably, I don't know whether they thought they were ever going to get paid or not, but they really couldn't be. And then you had public officials who negotiated those labor agreements, which realistically never could have been honored. So how do you sort of sort out this incredibly tangled knot where a lot of people acted in what was either good faith at the time, or sort of really with kicking the responsibility down the road? And now we sit here today. State has over $100 billion of liability. The city has over $25 or $30 billion of liability. It is both an overhang in terms of what our actual cost would be if we were actuarially funding this at a rate that didn't keep, if you wanted to simply fund these funds at the state, city, county level at a rate that didn't keep the unfunded liability growing. So if you just wanted to stop the pain, it would bankrupt all three levels of government instantly. It's not possible to do. So where does that leave us? We're going to have a very difficult conversation about how do you balance that? How do you reduce benefits to a level that are actually payable? How do you do this against a backdrop of a state legal system that is amongst the most restrictive in the country in terms of this debate about how our contract rights or pension rights intersect with the state constitution pension clause, and how that's going to play out? Different people have different views on it, and ultimately it'll be resolved by an elected Supreme Court that I'm sure has been watching this and knows it's coming to them, and knows they're going to have to deal with a very difficult balance. Against another backdrop, which is the state, the county, the city are huge debtors. We fund ourselves on a daily basis, and all of us go to financial markets multiple times a year in order to, largely at this point, refinance existing obligations. If the bond markets at some juncture say, we're not particularly interested in lending money to Illinois governments, we're in a really bad spot. So whatever discipline just out of fiscal responsibility might have existed prior to this, you don't have to worry about whether or not people are fiscally responsible. I'm here to tell you, as somebody who spent a lot of my life doing this sort of thing, we have no choice at this point. If we don't get things done in January, if the state legislature, governor, mayor, county board president, other political leadership in the state don't stand up and deal with this, we will face meaningful financial constraints going forward. This is critical that this happen now. And all the talk of kicking this down the road one more time or to some point in the future, I understand why that's an easier thing to do. I understand why that's appealing. It is just not really feasible. Now, people, will debate that topic. You'll hear people talk about, oh, markets will let you keep going. Don't worry about that. That's sort of scaremongering. People will talk about the tax rates in Illinois, whether or not, we could, I suppose on some abstract basis, sure, you can always increase taxes. Legislature could act to increase taxes. Governor could sign a tax bill if they wanted to. You could debate what that does to the Illinois economy that's already teetering with a very high tax burden, but in theory, that's one way to address it. I just think all those are sort of, most interest groups tend to take the view of let the other person pay for this. Somebody else is going to solve this, take it out of their hide. And that's just an absurd sort of way to respond to this, the tangle of this knot.
Neil, I want to get the county perspective, but Steve, I have a question for you first. In terms of you talking about sort of the era of contract negotiations and sort of, kind of pushing the pension costs down. I mean, so you're saying the thinking has to change. Do you feel like that's changing now with the city and its perspective in terms of?
Well, I can speak to the city. I obviously can't, I wouldn't speak to my colleagues, their particular problems. From a city perspective, we are deeply conscious, and the mayor has entered into a series of new labor contracts with a variety of public sector unions. Some with, most have happened with little fanfare and histrionics. Some have taken a little bit more of a public path. But as a general matter, we've very successfully sort of navigated our way through to arrangements that I think the labor movement perceives as in their interest and fair and responsive to what they need. And by the same token, the mayor is deeply focused, and his instructions to me are subtle but very clear, as he's capable of. Very subtle.
What's that subtle message?
Very subtle man, very calm, subtle man. And just quietly will say, just make sure that what we do is responsive to the protecting the taxpayers today, and not incurring, not kicking the can down the road, not incurring liabilities that are going to spring up or sort of appear later and create a problem. And that's what we try to do, and I think we've been pretty successful in it, in sort of what we've done over the last 18 months in that arena. But, all of that is against this backdrop of you have to, it's not an elephant, there's just a huge mass in the room, and it will smother us. And I don't mean to be hyperbolic, it just is a reality that we are up against a balance sheet crisis at all levels of government in this state, and we have to address it.
Yeah, I think it's just fascinating that, we've got 4 people up here that will all agree that the pension issue is huge. It is massive. Like Steve said, it is the elephant or the mass in the room. And it is really, really bad. We talk about the fiscal cliff on the national level. I mean, it's worse than that here on the local level. We need to take action now. I can say the county is probably in the best position of the 3 governments up here, and we're still funded at 58%. We will go bankrupt if we don't, make the changes that we need to make. And again, what's fascinating here is that not everyone agrees that this pension problem, when you're talking about the stakeholders that are making the decisions, either people don't agree that this problem is so massive, or they're just unwilling to act so quickly. It's a huge issue that cannot wait any longer. I'll talk about what I hope happens instead of what I think will happen, which is that, everyone gets around the table. You've got the month of December. There was House Bill 6258, which Crystal was talking about, that was introduced or talked about yesterday. And, it's focused on the state right now. And the mayor, I know, has a separate proposal down there. And, from the county side, we've engaged each of the unions in conversations to go over the actuarial numbers. And, there's, a discrete set of variables, probably 12 core variables, from things such as retirement age or healthcare retiree benefits, or, cost of living adjustments that can all be adjusted. And we're working through that process. And ideally, we'll get support from labor to the extent that we can. They've always been great partners with us, and get the support that we need at the legislative level and get this done by January 8th, because we can't wait any longer. But, I just, Steve talked about it, Crystal talked about it. This is a huge issue. It is a huge issue that, if left unaddressed, will cause either huge property tax increases or incredible cutbacks to services that a lot of people in the region just can't afford to see.
Now, if I could just put one thing, I'm listening to all this, and if you walk away, you think, wow, this is this insurmountable problem and unique to Illinois. The reality is, I think this is it's a problem that faces many, many municipalities around the country. It faces many of the states around the country. This is not unique to us. We have a particularly bad form of this disease, but the disease is widespread. Everybody has to face the simple reality that the public sector for an extended period of time has really wanted to defer cost and defer the question, defer the pain involved in what it costs to provide the level of service they did. So what you see going on at all three levels of government is a rethinking and an austerity, living on less and being smarter and trying to be very thoughtful about how to provide the services that are critically needed in a way that doesn't burden future generations. So we're doing that. I think, people, you see it at all levels of government, a really good track record in Illinois, and a real strong effort being made to bring budgets into line, to restructure, to eliminate that structural operating deficit that exists. Now is the time to turn to the balance sheet side and equally begin the repair process. We have to do that. And it's not going to happen, whatever happens in Springfield over the next month won't fix it. It'll make, our objective is to take a huge chunk out of it and to start us down the path to making sure people understand why we're doing this and what we're doing and how we're doing it, and then making progress toward a goal that's going to take 10, 15, 20 years to dig out of this mess. It wasn't created overnight. It won't be fixed overnight. The critical thing is to get us on that path. And once we do that, I think we can turn to what is really the more interesting, more important, and more critical function of how do we go forward? How do we grow a strong economy for the region? How do we make this the best place in the world for people to come to live, to make a life, to earn a living, to realize their aspirations? And what can government do to provide sort of support around that core human endeavor? And that's what we have to turn to. We got to get away from, we got to get enough of a fix. Otherwise, if we don't do this, it becomes this overhang, and that's all you talk about. It becomes this self-fulfilling prophecy, and it's a downward spiral. I mean, it's really not a good thing. So we got to move on from that.
And we are going to move on from this, but one last question for you guys. Do you think this will get worse? I mean, do you see this?
Well, I was going to say, it's actually, at least for us, it's more than an overhang. We have a mandated pension payment that we make at the state level, which grows every year. And so, 5 years ago, our pension payment was $1.8 billion. This year, it's 5.2. Next year, it's going to be $6 billion. The year after that, it will be $7 billion if we don't do something. So even more so than an overhang and something we'll keep talking about, it has very real and very serious consequences for our ability to fund other parts of the state budget and for municipalities and counties as well, because to the extent that they receive state dollars for education or for other programs, those are being cut back as well. So yes, if nothing is done, this is a problem that can and will continue to get worse, both from the budget perspective. We have the worst credit rating of any state in the nation right now, but it's not as low as it could go and could very well continue to be dropped. The bond rating agencies we talk to all the time, they are looking for real signs of leadership in Illinois that this problem is recognized and that we have the governance structure that can actually do something about it. And if we're not able to demonstrate that, our ability to borrow, our ability to fund future infrastructure investments or even our current debt, borrowing costs could be impacted by that in a serious way. So that's the other reason why you really can't talk about anything else in state government, any other priorities, any other spending, without talking about and addressing this issue. And that's why we spend so much time talking about it.
So, obviously you all spend a lot of time dealing with sort of these legacy costs, the ramification of previous governments. So I'm wondering, when you all, given the current situation, what do you all do to sort of, in the governing and policy decisions that you're making, do to prevent future legacy costs? What kind of things are you all thinking about in that realm?
I mean, you've got to start with your budgeting process, and you've got to make sure that you have a framework for the process that's given to your executive team that says we are going to make structural changes here, either on the expense side or the revenue side. We're not going to kick the can down the road. The way you close a $487 million deficit or similar deficits on the city side is to keep it from recurring every year. You make sure that it's all structural. You're making real cuts that will carry over year to year. You've got to explain again to the commissioners, to the electorate, to all community stakeholders why it is that you're doing this. A lot of times this involves you can get away with it, or you can do it by finding efficiencies, lowering costs in areas such as healthcare. It's great when policy is aligned with the idea of fiscal responsibility. For us, we run a huge jail, and trying to lower the jail population for us is huge. It costs $143 a day to keep somebody in jail. That's humongous. Whereas if you put them out on electronic monitoring, if they're low-level nonviolent offenders, it costs much less, almost half of that. So it's great when policy is aligned with fiscal responsibility and you're able to go out there and make the case that we're going to try to lower that jail population and make sure that they get the treatment that they need, and it's actually also cheaper. But again, it comes down to tough choices during this time, and you've really got to message well around it to make the case that it's structural and it's going to be recurring budgetary changes that will sort of drive down that year-to-year gap.
Neil, I think you mentioned an interesting point that I find sort of this interesting difference between the public sector and the private. And what's fascinating is, most people, most citizens, most voters if you stop 10 people walking down Roosevelt Road outside right now and asked them, do you think government's efficient? Do you think your money, your tax dollars you spend are well spent? And 9 out of 10 would answer no. And, hell, I'd probably answer no if they stopped me walking down the street. It is critical, really critical, that we address that core issue first. I think, from my perspective, if we can't stand up, if government can't represent itself to voters, to taxpayers, as being good stewards of their money, you can't ever expect to ask for more. It's just that simple. You have to start with the proposition that the electorate, that citizens, and most importantly, people who pay taxes, start with the proposition that their money is well spent and they get value back and they understand how that money is spent. And on some level, just as an outsider to government, you say, government for many years has done a pretty good job of obfuscating how money is spent. So a lot of effort's gone into sort of hiding how money was spent, sort of, doing it in all these incredibly convoluted, Baroque ways of figuring out how you were going to spend money. And you wonder why, and on some level, I guess my own sense is you do that, or it was done, because you wanted to sort of obscure or really, you didn't want clarity on that matter with taxpayers. And I think what's a critical predicate to anything we're trying to do, is to first do the hard work of making a huge organization efficient and effective, and to have people understand that money is spent well and they're getting what they should for the dollars they spend. Once you've got that, once we have that base, if we can achieve that at all levels, start with the federal government, which is obviously not a paragon of virtue in that respect, and work your way down through the state, the county, the city. And then you've got to deal with another reality, which is, at least at the city level, 70-80% of our costs, 70-ish% of our costs are people. So our people costs are largely governed by contracts, by labor union contracts. Those contracts have yearly increases. That's sort of baked into the American consciousness at this juncture, certainly into the American consciousness of labor management relations, is that you're going to have a contract and it's going to go up some percent a year. So if 70% of our costs are going up at some percent a year, point and a half, 2 points, 3 points, somewhere between 1% and 3% a year, depending on the era you enter into a contract, I don't, you have to deal with the reality that your costs are going up. Your overall costs are going up. The bulk of your costs are going up every year like clockwork. That has to mean that revenue is going to go up equally, or you're going to continue, that you're going to fix things and then you're going to get back into this growing gap. And that's what I don't think is really understood. I don't think we really deal with that reality. I don't think people in public life want to say to taxpayers, that's the simple economic reality of the way this works. It's the way private sector works, the way the public sector works. We have to deal with that. So we have first this issue of how do we make things efficient? How do we not just message, but how do we actually behave in a way that people, if you look at it critically, if you take the time to sort of go think about the way government works, if we get the media looking beyond the sort of, more entertaining scandal of the moment to the guts of how government actually is working, and people think about that and understand it, which how many people really want to spend their time thinking about that? But mainly a lot of people in this room probably enjoy that topic, and I find it sort of fascinating. If you get people thinking government is working well, you can move on to this next structural problem of how do you keep that structural deficit from always existing in a world in which everyone wants to believe taxes are going to be flat to going down, and costs are going to be rising because we want to pay people fairly.
So kind of in that room, let's talk about the collaboration between the city and the county. We're a year and a half into it now, I think. So what do you what do you think of it if you were going to start over, if you were going to give advice to another city, county that was going to go through that partnership? What would you say to them now?
Well, I'd just say, first of all, you have to have two leaders that are on the same page. It's not going to work without the two executive leaders, just being bought into the same vision there of again, I'll say it again, fiscal responsibility. So that's the biggest thing right there. There were so many points where this could have failed down the road, and we've been pretty successful. So it was a collaboration. The background here is a collaboration that identified up to $140 million worth of savings potentially over the course of 4 years on the high end. On the low end, $66 million. We've already identified $39 million of savings between the city and the county.
And are those are also, those 39, is that annual you're thinking?
It's 34 million of it is annual. Is annual so far, and that was in the first year. And we're big organizations. We've got a $3 billion budget. The city has a $6 billion budget, or maybe even more. And we employ, I think, collectively around 50,000 people at least. It's a huge. Some would call it a bureaucracy, but we both have similar functions. We both have revenue departments that go out there and try to collect collect on taxes. We both have huge technology shops that support the different functions that our respective governments do. We both have procurement organizations that go out and buy goods and services in the billions of dollars. So we can work together, not just even share best practices, but issue joint RFPs together, make sure that we can consolidate staff in certain areas where there are duplicative efforts, and it's been pretty successful. And I think it comes down to the two leaders at the top.
Steve, in terms of challenges, were there unexpected challenges you all think you've encountered that you didn't anticipate?
No, I think you're right. It really is just a matter of will. Again, there's sort of this interesting legacy phenomena. If we're at this moment in history where we start taking a pause, and if you look back and you look just at Illinois, but Illinois I don't think is radically different from a lot of places. We have units of government that you can't figure out what the heck they're about, why they exist, why we spend money on them. What's the number of, we have multiple thousands.
Would you name some of them?
Well, we have multiple thousands units of government in Illinois.
More than any other state.
Right.
So, and it's convenient, and I understand over time, it's nice you create something, and it seems like a good idea at the time, and we rarely go back and think, do we still need it? We're at one of those moments where you got to do that, and that's a huge lift, that's a huge project that gores any number of oxes, so that needs to happen. I'm not sure that's going to happen in my lifetime, but in the interim, you know, what you can do is, with the will of leaders who recognize that this is sort of absurd and it's just not productive for anyone, you can reach beyond that and you sit down and you say, okay, what do we really have to have? Two of this. Do we really have to separately have a county health system and a city health system? And the city basically got out of the health business from a providing services perspective in a lot of respects, and the county picked up a lot of that. And you know, the public health aspects and epidemiological aspects the city kept. But you know, there's sort of been a tremendous partnership there, and we've, you know, eliminated a lot of costs. Now, eliminating cost is not without its controversy, right? It means eliminating jobs. That's fundamentally, at this level of government, since 75% of our costs are people, if you're eliminating costs, you're eliminating jobs. That's a very mixed blessing that you want to do judiciously, because you don't want to create a terrible, more profound economic impact than it's worth to get the savings. But you have to look at every dollar, you have to look at every position, you have to look at all the services we provide and say, does that make sense? And there's still, you know, let's face it, there's enormous overlap between the state, city, county, boards of various sorts, units of government of various sorts. And, you know, it's not a happy topic, it's not a fun topic, it's not something that, you know, it's hard work, but I think it's incredibly necessary, and that's going to continue to have to be done.
And I think what you start to see, as you know, as we're talking up here, is that these issues, you can't look at them in silos. You know, they all intersect. So the question of operating more efficiently, and you know, when you do that, you're looking at you know, at cutting jobs. One of the things that we're doing, that Governor Quinn has been championing, is closing down some state facilities, closing down some prisons, some developmental disability centers, some hospitals, because a lot of our legacy costs are facility costs. You know, these facilities were built up, you know, decades ago. They have hundreds of millions of dollars in deferred maintenance. They're very expensive to operate, but a lot of people work there. And when we look at how to operate government more efficiently, we find out that community-based services is the, you know, best practice model right now. We have to move in that direction. We have to downsize. But that matters to communities. You know, the people who work in those facilities live in communities. That becomes an economic development issue, and we have to bring people together and collaborate around that and say, okay, so we're taking away these healthcare jobs, but here's what we can bring to the table, and here's how we can look at restructuring you know, the economy and addressing the concerns that the local community have about making these changes as well. But that's part of the challenge that we're dealing with, is that the legacy costs that we have, we're trying to make changes so that we don't continue to pass those along, or those don't continue to grow. But people depend on that. Every dollar the government spends is a dollar that somebody depends on, or somebody has come to count on, and you have to acknowledge that, and you have to really come together to work on does the model need to be now, and how can we move forward in a better and more efficient way so this is something that everybody can afford at all levels.
Right, and I think, Nyla, you asked the question about challenges, and the biggest challenge is just the different fiefdoms that exist at different levels of government. So I think it helped to have two new leaders that walked in the door in 2010, 2011, that literally sat across the hall from each other. I sit on the 5th floor, I think Steve sits on the 5th floor as well. Of the City Hall building, of the county building. It's actually the same building. There is a hallway that connects the two of us. And it's incredible that, you know, we're not actually we weren't working together more so when, you know, the city provides services to its 2.6 million residents. We provide services to the city's 2.6 million residents as well, plus the suburbs around it. There's obviously an overlap here. And I think at the top, you know, that message was received, and, you know, where there are some struggles, which we're working through right now, or when you have you know, different staff and folks who have been in government for a while, you know, saying, well, you know, this is the way things have always been. You know, we've always done it this way for reason X, Y, and Z, and they're experts in their field, and they know what they're doing. So it's hard to get those two groups together. But, you know, when you have the willpower at the top, you can make it happen.
I think there's sort of, two interesting elements of this that are unique to the public world, and one relates to what you're talking about, which is that, if we're human beings, we learn, we adapt, we grow over time. Interestingly, government doesn't do that incredibly well. So just take what you were saying about community-based services as opposed to centralized services. So we had a infrastructure that was built up at all levels of government around a theory of governing, around a theory of providing public services in, let's say, healthcare. Well, the reality is healthcare has changed dramatically, beyond comprehension in the last 20 or 30 years. And so what you find is the institutions that built up and the stakeholders around them and the reliance that people have upon that are incredibly resistant to evolution, to the change, to the technological change, to the change in what is considered the best practice in delivering a service. So as you get into this notion of how you're going to make things more efficient, how you're going to bring services better, how you're going to provide more effective services, you're fighting against this legacy problem of, the institutions that build up that now are trying to protect usually money that they're getting, and jobs or money or services that they don't want to see change, even though they may well acknowledge it's better in the aggregate to do this a different way. So you got that problem going on. The other problem is, Americans move. It's not like a lot of cultures. People move. People change where they live. They move from one part of a city to another. They move from one part of a state to another. 20, 30 years ago, the trend in northeastern Illinois was an exodus from the center city to not just the suburbs of Chicago, but to the far exurban regions of Chicago. So we had large corporations would leave a downtown office building and move out to 40 miles out in cornfields. They were building large office parks. Nobody's done that in the last 5 or 10 years, and nobody's going to do it in the next 5 or 10. Because their workers, the people that work for these companies and were driving that change 20 or 30 years ago, are now driving the reverse change. So when Motorola thought about what it was going to do, where it was going, this wasn't a fight between whether they go to Schaumburg or Hoffman Estates or somewhere that. Their fight was, do we go to Silicon Valley or do we be in downtown Chicago? So, against this backdrop of major shift in what population desires are and population movement is, you've got sort of new thinking or constantly new learning in how to best provide services, all of which makes for a pretty dynamic brew, which in reality, I think in the public sector, there tend to be unusually resistant forces to change.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk about Motorola and that move for a second, because if they're moved out of Illinois, that would have been that part of their incentives was to stay in the state, right? So they had to. So I'm curious about the move and the shift from the suburbs to the city. How does that, from an economic development perspective, how do you prevent sort of competition within the region?
Well, first of all, I don't think that was a competition within the region. This was not a choice, to my knowledge, of whether they were going to go, across the street from one suburb to another. They were making a decision. Do they leave the region? Do they take jobs and go to California, or do they stay here? So first, it's pretty simple to me, from our perspective, what's best? That they stay here. Now, that's best within a certain parameter. The New York Times has had a fascinating series for the last several days, or earlier this week, on economic incentives, and for those who haven't read it, I think it's worth reading. It's a really interesting start of an important dialogue on this topic, because I think it's a highly debatable topic that all of us deal in one form or another with every day. The reality is there are plenty of examples out there, and the Times did a good job of citing some of those examples where, political leadership has been inclined to throw money at a problem and say, we're going to get this auto plant built here, and we're going to put a lot of money against that, and it's going to burden our tax base for a long time to accomplish that, and their jobs for a few years, and then they move. Private companies will seek opportunity where it makes sense for them, and that's what they ought to be doing. There's nothing wrong with that. But, you know, the political infrastructure has to respond to that reality and not do stupid things. So we try really hard in this arena all the time with the state, working with the county, to be thoughtful about what are real economic opportunities that we're going to chase after and spend some taxpayer money in order to bring opportunity to the region as opposed to losing it outside the region, and what's just not economic. And you have to make choices in that respect. I don't think, and I don't think the history of the last few years has been one of competition between the suburbs and the city, or between downstate and the city. That's sort of to my mind, a waste of time. I think the real challenge is how we, as a large concentration of people, compete against other large concentrations of people around the globe. Our competition is as much Frankfurt, Germany, as it is Houston, Texas, as it is the state of California. The whole notion of these sort of political identities that people got obsessed about are not really the way humans organize themselves today, and I don't think are our true economic competition. We have to compete with whatever that form of human organization might be. It might be a country, might be another a state in the United States, might be a province in Canada, might be another city.
So how are you all realigning then? I mean, in terms of whether that's informally or formally to deal with this?
You know, in my limited experience, the state and the city primarily, because the county isn't a huge element of this particular part of government in terms of economic development. The state and the city work together very well. There's a huge amount of cooperation that goes on every day. I go to pitches all the time with companies, and there are people from the state there, and there are people from the city there. They seem to work together fine. I have yet to see any real problems in that respect. So it's fine, it's good.
So when you look at these kind of deals, these packages that we put together, whether it's economic development, community development, working with bringing or retaining jobs in the state, it does tend to be a package of different financing structures, and there would be state financing, there would be a city component, but we do try to work together and make sure that our vision is aligned, about where the city wants to go, what the state wants to do, and I think with this leadership, for the most part, it is. But the other thing, and it's a very good point, that we're not just looking regionally for within Illinois or even across the Midwest, but globally. So you see a lot more collaboration and cooperation across the Midwestern states, because we're trying to package ourselves as a region to be competitive against foreign markets, and we work together through McCormick Place to bring large shows and conferences to Illinois, to Chicago, because we know that that's an opportunity for us to better market ourselves and to let businesses, to let potential investors know about everything that we offer and what we bring to the table. And I think that's critically important for us to be on the same page and to collaborate around being able to do those things.
So what do you see as sort of the state's role in helping local economic development?
Well, I think a big part of it is, is funding. But this is a theme, because I think it's a theme for us, across the state, is breaking down the silos around, economic development, because it's, both about jobs and making Chicago and making Illinois an attractive place to invest and to locate. But a lot of that also has to do, with other factors such as, what's our education system like? What are our neighborhoods like? What's the crime rate like? And so we really are looking across the board at our responses to, both the economic, but also, the social, the educational components of the makeup of our state, and making sure that, the infrastructure, making sure that where we target our increasingly, shrinking resources, are getting to those areas of highest need and highest priority. And part of what we have to do working together is to identify where those high needs and where those priorities are, and pool our resources as much as possible to do that. And we have done that around violence prevention, for instance, in some of the neighborhoods in Chicago. And we've done that around healthcare with the county, and addressing the needs of the population that the county serves. In the health and hospital system, and what we can do as a state, and helping to leverage federal dollars in order to make sure that we are addressing that.
Yeah, I would just say, at the county, we're focused on healthcare and public safety. That's 2/3 of our budget, but economic development is also becoming a priority for Cook County, because jobs and how people live affect our healthcare system, and it affects our jails and our public safety system. Economic opportunity is huge. And I think we've seen a lot of work being done over the last 3 years, around the issue of regional economic development. The OECD came out with a fantastic report. CMAP, the Chicago Metropolitan Agency for Planning, Chicagoland, I think, has put out a Go-To 2040 plan. World Business Chicago has put out a plan for economic growth and jobs. And they all say, very similar things. If Chicago wants to compete on a global scale, if you want to compete against the Shanghais, the London cities, or regions that have 10 million people there with incredible assets and incredible institutions across that population of 10 million, Chicago has to go at it with a regional approach. There's 2.6 million people in Chicago. Even if you extend it to the county, it's 5.2 million people. You've got to start really thinking about the 6-county region or the 10-county region. And further down the road, the 14-county region, which includes Milwaukee and elements of Northwest Indiana and Southeastern Wisconsin, we're moving to a regional approach. And it's about, it's not about competition within, Chicago and the suburbs. Honestly, what's good for Schaumburg is good for Chicago. What's good for DuPage County is good for Cook County. Workers don't just stop at the line. They'll go to where the job is. We have infrastructure that will take them from Schaumburg down to downtown Chicago. So you've got to really take a regional approach to this. And I think the county wants to step up and play a bigger role in being a convener. We're not a funder. We don't have the dollars to spend on this. But you can bring groups together and work together. Because we do have assets throughout the region, and we do have educational institutions, not just in Chicago, not just in the suburbs, but throughout the entire region, that if you coordinate the efforts and the resources, you can make a measurable and meaningful impact on growing jobs in this region.
Let's switch gears a little bit and talk a little bit about one of the things I mentioned in the beginning about suburban poverty and social safety net issues. One of the things we're seeing, DuPage County rates of suburban poverty that we've never seen, and of course this is a nationwide trend, but in Chicago, I feel like we've focused so much of our efforts on solving and working on poverty within the city. I'm curious, first of all, Neil, to get your perspective from the county on how that's playing itself out.
I'm sorry, just on the poverty.
Sort of the idea of how you're tackling this sort of new suburban poverty.
I don't think it's new. I think it's
bigger.
Yeah, bigger and being talked about. And it's probably suburban poverty and the issues in the suburbs are probably being hit a lot harder in this economic time. You're right, absolutely. And we see it a lot in the south suburbs. That a lot of these cities down there don't have the nonprofits or don't have the support services that you'll see in urban areas. When funding is cut, in these suburban areas and they're hit really hard, you'll see the support services go away. I think we see it mostly in our health system, honestly. We've dedicated some programming towards community development programs. We get funding through the state, we get funding through the federal government, and we've really focused that on tangible projects to create jobs in the south suburbs and opportunities. But we see it in our health system. We see, our payer mix changing from, under 50% being self-payers, which is just a euphemism for uninsured, to over 50%. And, that has a great fiscal impact for us, and it has an impact on quality of care. And it's something that we've been working with the state actually a lot on addressing.
Well, and I would say from our perspective, we definitely see that, in our state agencies that, that serve the low-income population, greater demand in the suburban, offices, the need to kind of move more, more staff and create greater access in those areas because, we're seeing an increase in the need. And as Steve said, government isn't known for being nimble and being quick in responding to those changes in demographics or the changes in operating, moving operations to where the need is. But it's something that we are looking at and trying to do. And then also, I'll continue with the theme of healthcare. Moving forward, we do have the Affordable Care Act, and health reform is a huge opportunity, for us. I think both we were able to leverage that, with Cook County with a Medicaid waiver to be able to get federal funding to cover more of the uninsured, and we have seen more uninsured. We've seen an increase in the number of people enrolled in our Medicaid program, our traditional Medicaid program as well, and gearing up that hopefully we'll be able to take up the federal option to cover more of the uninsured under the poverty level in the Medicaid program. But that also means that there is a huge need to build up capacity in those areas. So that matters for the healthcare system, for the doctors and the hospitals that serve in those areas. We hear a lot from them in that they're seeing their rate of uncompensated care, their rate of Medicaid going up, and what that means for their finances and their ability to remain viable. We're seeing that, hearing from the food banks and the food pantries, seeing an increase in the number of people who, have that need, and what can we do to make sure that we're doing more outreach for, the supplemental nutrition assistance program and those kind of things. So it's something that we definitely see, and it's something that, we're working to respond to, and it's not easy. Knowing that in a lot of ways we have fewer resources in which to respond to that greater need.
So we're almost to the end of our time, but I wanted to ask all of you, from the perspectives of everything that we've talked about today, what do you all need more from each other? Or from, if you don't want to answer that one, what do you need more from? I'll give you a pass.
We all want,
other than money.
Happy to have Crystal send us checks.
And remember, we're talking about this in the context of the new normal, so that money is off the table. What do you all need more from each other to work better with each other, or with the federal government as well?
Who wants to start with that? I think I'll start with the obvious and just say the communication. I think that there is much better communication across the levels of government than there ever has been in the past, but that doesn't mean that there's not areas that can be improved, and I think that to the extent that we have good and in a lot of ways informal models and informal ways that we work together, the more we're able to do that, and when we identify the opportunities where we might be able to more formalize them, I think that's best for Chicago as a region, and very beneficial to the state as well. I mean, obviously, we look statewide, and there are a lot of different regions, a lot of different urban areas, in the state. Chicago being the biggest and critically important. But that's what we're trying to do, just making sure that we at the state level understand what the plans are, what the priorities are, what direction do the city and county want to go, so that we can be prepared, to respond to that. And then as we're making decisions at the state level, we're cognizant of that, and hopefully we'll be able to better align where we're going with state policy as well.
So I'm curious, in terms of that, do you feel sometimes, we've talked about a lot of formal partnerships. Do you feel sometimes the informal partnerships or that communication works is more effective?
I think that it can be. I think Neil said that really, it comes from the top. So, when you have leadership that, have those relationships and are on the same page, that's when that can be effective. I think sometimes you have, those formalized relationships, regional planning organizations or whatever, that might be, created and imposed top down, that might not be as effective because the people involved just aren't as bought in. So I think that buy-in has to happen first. I think in our cases, you do see a lot of collaboration that's already happening. And I think that that's when, once that's already starting to happen, that's when it makes more sense to try to formalize and, and get those systems in place that can be even more effective to respond. But I think that there's value in letting that happen a little bit organically, and then, and then moving forward with it and expanding it.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so Crystal said communication. Who wants to go next?
I think there is good communication on a working level, and at any given time, you're going to have political leaders who have their particular agendas. To the extent those agendas are aligned and in sync and largely focused on the same things, you're going to have really powerful things happening. That's not necessarily the system we live in. I mean, the American system, by some in some respects, is designed to have competing political actors who are going to have their individual objectives and individual priorities. When those priorities are in alignment, you get a lot of movement. When those priorities aren't in alignment, each will do their best to continue to make progress on what they're trying to accomplish. I think what's fundamental here is there's a pretty broad consensus. There's not a lot of debate on the topic of how this region is going to prosper. And it's pretty clear that the city has to do well, the county has to do well, and the state will benefit largely as a result of that. The state has its own issues, which are, it's a big geographic region, and there's people within the state who may feel distant from that economic, the Northeast region, which has its own sort of economic force of gravity. So the state has to mediate that interest and deals with that every day, and we're sort of sensitive to that dilemma, and we understand that that's going to occasionally lead to differences of view. But I think as a general matter, we're in an era where everybody has a pretty clear consciousness that we're all in this together. We have to, our issues are not with each other, our issues are with Shanghai, or our issues are with Germany, or our issues are with California. And, we have to work it out here, or else we're going to suffer with respect to our ultimate competition with other regions that we're trying to compete with. So as a starting point, we have pretty good alignment. It's pretty good communication. I think ultimately we're also in an era where all of us, for varying reasons, will come to the same reality, which is we live in an era where efficiency is not just a desire or a goal, it's a necessity. And that creates that creates a real opportunity to figure out how we're all going to improve our own operations and improve our own efficiency by working together well. And we'll continue to do that. And that'll be a positive thing, I think, for the region and for people. And I think we all have challenges that are largely aligned, but somewhat different depending on the political jurisdiction. And that's going to, I think, occasionally lead to some difference of opinion of where priorities ought to be or where we should be spending time and attention. As well as we all get along, as well as the leaders are going to be aligned, the simple reality of the political constituency at different levels, their interests may be focused on other, different things at any given moment, and they've got to respond to that. That's the nature of public life. So there you're going to have some toing and froing. But I think as a general matter, I'd say as the newest to this venture and perhaps the most of an outsider, it's surprisingly good. I don't see it as a huge impediment to what we all need to accomplish right now. Hope that stays the same.
Yeah, I would agree with Steve. Given the circumstances here, I think, the three units of government and the leaders all work together, and, where the priorities are aligned, they focus their efforts and are able to make big change. And historically, it hasn't been like that in Illinois at those three levels, at the state, at the city, at the county. there have been fiefdoms, there have been political turf wars that got in the way of progress, and I think people here are focused on, and our leaders here are focused on outcomes that serve the residents, which is really critical and important. So along those lines, I think, we're in good shape. One of the areas I do think we can work on, you brought this up, was informal collaborations. And I don't think it's necessarily with the city and the state, but with the other groups in the region, whether it's foundations or community groups, whether it's a faith-based community. It's engaging them when you're making critical decisions. Chicago is a very political place, and these folks have influence, and they want to be. Yes, it is political.
Is gambling here?
Yeah, it's. I think we got the city manager of Las Vegas here. We can talk to her about that. But these folks have influence, and they want to be at the table when decisions are being made, because they represent powerful groups and interested groups. So I think having the conversations when we're making policy decisions with these different stakeholders, whoever they may be in whatever policy area, public safety, healthcare, economic development, job creation, education, having them at that table could always be just a little bit better. It makes the process go a little bit smoother. And at the end of the day, you may not agree with someone, and it's going to be played out publicly, and it's not going to end well. But I think that's an area where we could probably all say that we want to improve on going forward.
So we've covered a lot of ground here. We've covered everything from economic development to suburban poverty to our legacy costs. Since I had the first word, I'm going to let you all have the last word. And any other last concluding thoughts about this? How do we stay resilient in this economic reality, in the era of we cannot do business as usual and these looming fiscal problems?
I guess I don't, that may not be my biggest worry. I think we are resilient, and we are resilient by both human nature and by the moment in history we're at. We're at a moment in history where people want to live in cities. People either have to live in cities because of economic necessity, because that's where opportunity is, or they actually prefer that as a way of I think, living their lives. That's why you see that trend, that force happening around the globe. It's not unique to the United States. It's certainly not unique to the developed world. It is just the force of what's happening. So there is resilience in this point on the globe by definition, just because that's what people want. I think that the challenge for the public sector is how to respond to that, how to provide services that make that a better life as opposed to a worse one, and how to sort of move forward, how to not get caught in the trap of our own legacy, in the trap of our own complications of history. But that's a huge opportunity. It's an incredibly exciting moment. This is an exciting place to be right now. There's enormous dynamic energy in this part of the world. There's new companies being founded every day. There's people prospering. There's people figuring out how to live their lives better. You've got all kinds of institutions that are sort of in processes of rebirth. You've got incredibly exciting things going on in the educational system at all levels, not just in what is arguably the best higher education system in the planet, which is hugely concentrated in northeastern Illinois and got this incredible asset of UIC and the other universities in the area. But what's happening in terms of reform and change and growth, all the way down to the preschool level and the elementary school level at Chicago Public Schools. This is an exciting moment, I think, for us, for this region, for the city, for the state, for the county. There's just a lot of opportunity, and there's a lot of good things that can happen as long as we don't screw it up.
Yeah, I'll just say, we talked a lot about our problems here and how big they are, but there is a lot of hope out there, and I think, again, it comes down to the leaders that you have in place, and they've been willing to take, a stance on really tough choices. They've been willing to reform and take a look at a lot of different policy areas or a lot of different operations that people in the past have not wanted to really shine a light on and say, can we do this in a better way? Can we do this more efficiently? And, you know, is this business as usual going forward? So I think there's a lot of hope when it comes down to looking at the new leaders we have in place. And part of it's driven by the fiscal environment that we're in. But, you know, I think there's been some really, really great successes over the past 2 years and all the different policy areas, economic development, healthcare, education. There's some really new, exciting things going on that, you know, over the long term will have some great impact on our region.
And I would agree. I mean, I think that even though we're a state that has a lot of great challenges, we're also a state that has a lot of strengths and a lot of resources. And I'm very optimistic about our resilience and our ability to, you know, really address the problems that we have and, you know, and build up a better future. And I think all of us have that level of optimism at one, you know, one way or another. That's how we get up every day and do what we do. You know, and a big part of it, as we've talked about, you know, is addressing the legacy costs is really from the state level, looking at our systems. I mean, a lot of it's both about efficiency, you know, within government and within our agencies, but it's also about looking at the systems that we have, whether it's our human service system, our healthcare system, our educational system, our long-term care system. A lot of the work that Governor Quinn has charged us to do is look at how we deliver services and how government, you know, operates and all of the people that we fund within all of those systems, and figure out how to make them more resilient and how to help them respond to this new normal so that we've got a better foundation to build on moving forward. And I know that that's what we work on doing every day, and that's what we're going to be able to do.
Well, thank you. Thank you all for your candor. Thanks for all of the information. I think this has been a great discussion. Neil Kare is the Chief of Staff for Deputy Chief of Staff
take that job.
for Cook County. You don't want a promotion? Steve Koch is Deputy Mayor. Crystal Thomas is Deputy Governor. Let's give a hand to her.
Good to see you.